A slightly different podcast this week to tie in with the very first War Graves Week. This is a new initiative by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and this year it's to draw some attention to the graves and the places where, across the UK, thousands and thousands of servicemen from both world wars are buried. This is the two world wars effectively on our doorstep. And for this special episode, we'll be joined not by one, but three podcast guests. Megan Maltby and James King from the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and Barnsley born and bred Martin Garnett, who works as a battlefield guide. He'll come with me round one of the cemeteries here in Barnsley. So let's begin with Megan Maltby, who worked as a Commonwealth War Graves Commission intern, is a military historian, and now works as a public engagement officer for the Commission. Okay, well, thanks for joining us, Megan. Tell us a little bit about what War Graves Week is to start off with.
Yeah, of course. So War Graves Week is our first National Awareness Week. So it's launching for the first time this year, starting on the 21st of May, so the anniversary of the creation of the Commission. So from the 21st of May until the 28th of May, we've got events taking place across England, Scotland and Wales. And what you'll be able to find out at these events is a bit more about our work at the UK, in the work that we do here in the UK, and really to just raise awareness of what the Commission does and how our work, does look quite different, and really to engage those local communities with those sites that are often so nearby, but people potentially, this past year have done their daily walk through one of these sites, but really know very little about the casualties that are commemorated there, or why these sites are here and why these people are here in the UK. So that's really what we're trying to achieve through War Graves Week, through these physical events. We've also got tours taking place at other sites across the UK. So these are all ticketed, so you have to book through our website, which people can do. And what War Graves Week is also really kick-starting are these tours that we will continue to do throughout the summer into the autumn up to Armistice Day. And really just to engage people with their local heritage. There's some really fascinating stories within these sites. And so War Graves Week is really there to highlight our work in the UK. And as I said, this is very much our first year of doing it. So we hope that next year, especially when there's less restrictions in place across the world, that we can move War Graves Week around and highlight our other sites across the world. So it won't always be just focused on the UK.
But here in the UK, like you said, I think that many people don't realise they've got this heritage from the two world wars quite literally on their doorstep.
Absolutely. So when people think of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, they usually think of the kind of row upon row of headstones in cemeteries across the former battlefields, in places like France and in Flanders. But there really is a great number of war graves here in Great Britain. And in fact, there's over 300,000 servicemen and women who are either buried or commemorated here. And this is actually more than in any country with the exception of France. So we do this in over 12,000 different locations. So the work that our operations team have cut out for them is really quite a task in all of these different pockets of the UK. Of course, as we know, that during both world wars, that Britain became a kind of island fortress and a base for equipping and training troops, and also launching land, sea and air operations. So in both conflicts, you had casualties, from the skies. There was things going on overseas and things like that. And so Britain also became this main centre for medical care of men and women serving in the armed forces. So, there was thousands of hospitals across the country to treat this service personnel who were wounded. So, of course, therefore, here in Great Britain, many of those who are buried or commemorated here are those who were killed in action in the air while defending the home front, others who had drowned in coastal waters, but the majority were wounded who came back or who contracted disease on active service, were transported back to Britain and subsequently died while undergoing hospital treatment or recovering in private homes. So the thing that's really unique about Great Britain is that those who died here were able to lay parents and families and brothers and sisters and husbands and wives were able to lay their relatives to rest where they wished, which isn't something people were able to do overseas. So that's why it often looks quite unique as to where these graves are, and it's not the same formations that we have in places like Western Europe.
And considering that these men have come back from battlefronts and women as well and died from their injuries, that then means that these graves connect us to almost every battle and campaign of the two world wars.
Absolutely. So you really hear such a wealth of stories in Great Britain of where these people were and what they did during the wars. So it really offers a different insight. And as you say, you get a whole array of stories just within one cemetery.
And a broad spectrum of Commonwealth troops as well, I guess.
Absolutely. So I think often people think that if they're people that have, come back to Britain with their wounds and illnesses, that they were people that grew up here, but that's just not the case. We have a vast amount of cemeteries across the UK, with huge amounts of Canadian burials, Australian burials. Down in Seaford, we have a large West Indies plot there, and it's in all these unique locations, and you think, how did they end up there and what happened there? But it was often as these troops are being transported as well that things happened. And Commonwealth burials tend to be collated in one place because it's often where they had, military hospitals. If you look at the Chattery, Patcham Down Memorial in Brighton, where many of those men were treated in Brighton Pavilion, and they're now, they were cremated and they're remembered up there in the middle of the Downs. So there's all these really unique heritage sites that really tell the story of the World Wars and of everyone that was involved in them.
And some incredible stories behind so many of those men and women commemorated in the UK.
Absolutely, you get some really sobering stories here in the UK, and I think what I find quite unique as well here is having lots of headstones where there are family members buried in the same plot. I know that in Great Britain I found lots of stories of husbands and wives that are buried in the same place because they were able to do that if they died over here. So you get some really interesting snippets of information. And because here in the UK, what you were able to do was choose a private memorial. So you didn't have to have the kind of standard commission headstone that you see. The families were able to decide. And whilst they're often the more difficult ones to find within a cemetery, and they offer some real complications in terms of maintenance, the real advantage to those is the families could put whatever they liked on them. So what that actually offers you without having to go into the depths of research or anything is just reading a lot of text on a headstone, and can often give you the information as to where siblings for fathers, sons, and all of that kind of information that you can just read upon this headstone.
And that makes it very personal, doesn't it? I mean, it connects us to a wider family in a way that a normal war grave, if that's the right phrase, that we'd see on the Somme or in Normandy, wouldn't quite always do that.
Absolutely. So you're looking at this headstone, and there's potentially a note to say that their brother is remembered on this grave, that he is buried somewhere like the Somme. So it's connecting that family story and all of those relatives that went off to fight and died and all ended up buried in different places.
And just working back a bit, how did you come to work yourself for the Commonwealth War Graves Commission?
So I've always had an interest in history. I studied a French and history degree. So as you can imagine, when the Commonwealth War Graves Commission internship came up, I thought, wow, that's a fantastic opportunity. That really links both of my interests. However, I was an intern based in Belgium at Tynecott, so as you can imagine, my French was a little bit redundant there. But actually, it was the most fantastic experience being an intern at Tynecott. And that was really, I knew a bit about the commission beforehand, but that really kind of brought to light the work that the commission does for me. So following that, I became the public engagement coordinator for the South East of England, and then starting as the public engagement manager back in January last year. So that's kind of been my career progression within the commission, really just stemming from an interest in history from a young age.
And normally that would take you off to quite a few different battlefields, I would guess. But obviously, in a year or more of COVID, we've all been restricted to what's at home, and I suppose that's the importance of this forthcoming week.
Absolutely. So that's what War Graves Week is really there to show, is that you don't have to travel the world. I mean, as much as we'd all like to, I'm sure we're all desperate to get back to the battlefields and visit those cemeteries there. But what War Graves Week is all about is what's on your doorstep. All of the graves we have here, especially in the UK, almost every village, town and city will have a war grave. There'll be someone commemorated in those local churchyards and cemeteries. So the recently relaunched Commonwealth War Graves Commission app actually allows you to do that really easily. Just using your location will point out all of the Commonwealth War Graves that are nearby, which you can then go and visit and see how you get on finding them. So that's really what we're here to do is engage people with their local heritage and what's on their doorstep.
And the sort of work that the Commission does in the UK compared to on the battlefields, I would guess it would be slightly different in the way it's carried out and who does it?
Absolutely. So James will speak more about kind of our operational work in the UK. But in terms of how it's carried out, it's just very different. What we're dealing with here in the UK is not land that we own the vast majority of the time. It's run by councils, it's friends groups, it's all there's private landowners where we have graves. So it's a really different experience for our works teams. And 90% of our sites in the UK have less than 10 burials. So they're really spread out and there's really very few graves in there. So the same kind of borders and flower arrangements that you recognise from the battlefields and you see in places like Brookwood and Stonefall and other sites around the UK just aren't possible in the vast majority of sites. So I think it's reminding people that although these sites look very different, the stories are still very much there. Just because you don't have that kind of huge sea of headstones in front of you doesn't mean that the stories aren't just as interesting and the people aren't just as fascinating who are underneath them.
You mentioned Brookwood there. I was going to say that the people perhaps don't realise that there are military cemeteries of the like that one would see on the battlefields, and Brookwood, I believe, is the largest of them.
Yes, so Brookwood is the largest commissioned site in the UK. We have over 5,000 people buried there, as well as having a First World War and Second World War memorial. And again, really telling the Commonwealth experience there. We've got a huge variety of people commemorated at the site, women included as well. And it's a fascinating place. And for those people that are very used to the battlefields, you feel a lot more at home at somewhere like Brookwood because it does have that look and feel about it. As of course, as Brookwood itself being a wood, the fantastic woodland that surrounds it, it's a really beautiful site. And it's actually one of the locations we're holding a War Graves Week event this year. And Brookwood is somewhere where we have a fantastic volunteer tour guide programme. So the volunteer guides will be carrying out tours of the site for free throughout the summer and on to remembrance. So if anyone wants to come and hear more about the stories of those commemorated there, that's a great opportunity to learn more.
And again, looking at the burials that we find in just civil cemeteries as well as the big ones like Brookwood, a lot of people perhaps who have only got a fringe interest in military history perhaps think that war's all about men and bombs and bullets and bayonets, but actually these cemeteries tell a very wide story, don't they?
Absolutely. So it's often people that were doing work, here at home as well. So people on the home front that, were on active service and died as a result of enemy action. Especially during the Second World War, you were by no means, safe from that kind of enemy action. And that's why we have the civilian roll of honour, which sits separately to commemorate all those civilians who did lose their lives. So yeah, it's really about showing that it's not just men on the battlefields, and those are of course stories that are well worth remembering too. But it's looking at all the different jobs people had during the World Wars and some of the interesting things and that happened there for them to end up in those places. One example that we've been highlighting this past year really has been the story of Noor-Inayat Khan, who was commemorated on the Runnymede Air Force's memorial. She was part of the Special Operations Executive, and the fascinating and interesting work and really quite dangerous work that she did during the Second World War that ultimately led to her being commemorated on the Runnymede Air Force's memorial is just another story that we try and highlight, that their names ended up here for whatever reason because they were attributed to those regiments. But by no means are they any less interesting than those on the battlefields.
No, I was going to ask you about Runnymede because it's an incredible memorial. It sits there in the flight path of so many modern jets. I mean, when modern jets are flying at the moment, but there it is, and there's her name on there. Iconic Battle of Britain Spitfire pilots and bomber command men, and again, it tells an incredible story of the Second World War.
It really does. It's such a, not only being fascinating because of all the stories that are there, it's beautiful. It's an absolutely beautiful site. You know, when COVID allows, open up the tower again to go up to the kind of terrace area where you can see those planes taking off from Heathrow. And just it's so peaceful up there. It's truly a spectacular place to go and visit. And as you say, those stories, that variety you get, especially on a memorial, I think it's harder for people sometimes to kind of hone in on any names on a memorial. It's a lot more, you know, there's a lot to take in, that people don't quite appreciate the stories that are behind those names because there are just so many. So that's another thing through War Graves Week, and our new downloadable tour guides that you can get from our website, that people can print off and take round with them, really shares the stories of those that are there. So they become much more than just a name on a memorial.
And new media is a really important part of what the Commission does now. I mean, I can remember perhaps only 2 decades ago when, and this is not an unkind view, but the Commission thought its job was to cut grass and tend memorial sites, not to do this sort of thing. But the world's changed, hasn't it?
Absolutely. And whilst what you just said is still very much at the core of what we do, and that's exactly what we're here for, you know, that's our commission. We know that we really need people to remember what we're doing. You know, that as we know, the generations of veterans are passing away, and we don't have that kind of physical reminder of what people went through. Whilst there's still plenty of people around who were alive in the 30s and 40s, we don't quite have as many kind of obvious symbols of what happened. So especially for young people, which is really what our public engagement team, who are based here in the UK, are for. So we have 11 coordinators based across England, Scotland and Wales, and they're really here to engage people with what we're doing, because we can keep going out there and mowing the lawns and maintaining the headstones and keeping these sites beautiful, but unless people are visiting them and learning about the stories of those who were commemorated there, we risk people kind of losing all kind of memory of the First and Second World War. So that's really what the coordinators are there to do, you know, going into schools, taking school groups out to these sites, so these young people not only know about, you know, what's on their doorstep, but really have that reminder of, oh, this did happen, and, you know, these are these fascinating stories of these incredibly brave people that made it back to the UK, but unfortunately still, you know, succumbed to their illnesses or their wounds.
And that's that engagement with a younger generation of people is a really important thing, and I think that, you know, people think maybe young people just spend all their time on TikTok, but the reality is when they hear some of the stories that, you know, you've got essentially in your archives, then they do engage with them. They're fascinated by them.
Absolutely, and I think it's always a bit of a misconception to think that young people wouldn't be interested in the world wars. I think you've just got to find the right way to engage them, and picking the stories that are relevant to them, which is really what, you know, the public engagement team put a lot of work into doing, is tailoring what we do to make it relevant to that audience. So, you know, we did a lot of work with the Brownies and the Girl Guiding Association with the NOR project, and it's really getting girls interested in, you know, not just thinking it was a man's war, but there was plenty of, you know, extraordinary things that women did. And it's the same with, you know, looking at the diverse casualties that we commemorate across the UK as well, and really showing the Commonwealth contribution, which we can do very easily here in the UK.
And beyond the time of COVID, when we can return to the battlefields again, although this year you're concentrating, as you said, on the home front, let's call it, there's the wider world of war graves, and we'll be back there, I hope, again soon. What does the Commission have planned sort of going forward into the next few years?
So we've got a lot of work cut out for us to do over the next few years. I think, as I said, with War Graves Week this year, we've very much started with the UK, mainly because, you know, we have a huge head office base here in the UK, and, you know, we wanted to engage with people locally. But that will absolutely move around the world, and, you know, we can expand these programmes that we've been able to pilot in the UK. So what we've done this past year is launch our Eyes on Hands On programme, where people can, you know, go out and look after their local war graves. Our Cantor Speakers programme, which allow us to engage with more groups across the UK. And these have all very much been deliberately piloted here in the UK for us to evaluate them and make sure they're running successfully, which they are so far. So we can take these anywhere else in the world. There's no reason we can't be doing talks and things across, you know, France and Belgium and further afield. I'm not sure you'll get any of the gardeners in France and Belgium letting the public clean the headstones, but that's absolutely something that's working really well here in the UK right now. So yeah, it is about these programs that lots of people will have heard of over the past year that seem very UK centric. But these are really it's just the beginning for us in terms of, you know, getting our message out there and engaging with people on a local level.
And going forward, the internships that you do will be part of that.
Absolutely. So being an intern for me was what really kickstarted my interest in the commission and really kind of continued my passion for the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. So what the internship is, for those people that don't know much about it, it's an opportunity for young people, so 18 plus, to go out to France or Belgium and essentially act as a kind of information guide, really based on the site. So to, you know, members of the public that turn up to share the stories and take people on tours of the cemeteries and memorial. So it's an incredible experience for any young person that, you know, has got any kind of interest in history or remembrance and who would like an opportunity to live abroad. We're really hopeful that next year we can resume business as usual in regards to the internship. Obviously last year and this year we had to put things on hold regarding that, but that's absolutely something that, you know, will long continue and is one of the really great things that the Commission does to engage that younger generation, and by giving them the opportunity to really put them in the heart of remembrance, so to speak. You know, being at Tynecott and Tietbow is really that opportunity to be there and engaging with people every day. And I know with our intern alumni that it still exists, that passion for the Commission definitely lives on after the internship. And we hope that, you know, there'll be many more interns to come.
And for you personally, having been an intern, I mean, you lived in that space of the cemeteries of the Great War for several months. It must have changed the way that you saw them and thought about them.
Absolutely. It feels, you know, heading into Tynecott every day, it just, you felt like you got to know the graves that were there and the people that were there, that you would, you know, in your morning recce where you would wander around and make sure everything was okay, you'd stop off at these different headstones and they became a really familiar sight to you. And their stories just really resonated. And I think especially somewhere like Tynecott, where I was based, it was also having so many unknown soldiers that were there and making that effort to go around and have a moment with those who, you know, have, you know, we don't know their names and we don't know who they are. And it really is something that stays with you, I think, long past the internship, is that, you know, waking up every day and heading to somewhere like Tynecott to just share that knowledge with people, you know, about what's going on there, and, you know, the stories of the casualties. It's an experience I wish I could do over and over again, and I'm sure as a battlefield guide, you know, that's one of the things you enjoy doing is getting out there over and over again. And every time you have a different group, it's a different story and it's a different part of the cemetery you take them to, and it's just endless, that the work that you can do there at such a fascinating site.
And meeting members of the public who were coming to see a grave or a name on the Tynecott Memorial must have been quite a powerful experience.
Incredibly powerful. It was, whilst, you know, I had some of the best times at Tynecott, it was a very emotional experience, being that person always there, you know, as you say, taking someone to a grave of a relative. It's an incredibly emotional experience for them, and there was plenty of occasions where people, you know, were visibly upset, and it's very moving to see that happen. And I think also, especially regarding the Tynecott Memorial, is people coming along and sharing stories, you know, things that you didn't know, and it's their relative and they know that firsthand, whether that's information passed down generations or, you know, from their own personal research. It was a very kind of humbling experience hearing all of these stories and you know, being in that very emotional setting. I think it's, you know, having been there, you know, 5 days a week for 4 months, you can sometimes have those moments of kind of losing what you're there for, and, you know, losing perspective of what you're standing in front of, because you get so used to the environment that actually having members of the public regularly coming in and being visibly moved gives you that reminder of, oh, this is why I'm here and this is what this site's about. And it's just somewhere like Tynecott, it's just so powerful.
And I guess it demonstrates as well that people's connection to this and connection to the cemeteries and memorials of the Great War is something that's not diminishing in any way.
Absolutely not. I think we think that there's potentially, you know, post the centenary years of the First World War, that the public have lost interest in going to these sites, but that just couldn't be further from the case. When we ran tours, even of our sites here in the UK last year, you know, they sold out very quickly because people are still very much engaged with this topic. And there's some people that are only just beginning their research into their relatives. And I think that's something that always comes with time, of people being interested in their family history. Whilst it's not always, the first thing people do, I do think everyone gets to a point of wanting to look back a bit. And that's what the Commission is going to continue maintaining, these graves and memorials. So even people, 50, 100 years down the line who think, oh, there's this relative that I've researched, they'll have that place to go visit.
And for War Graves Week, people can find out more on the Commission's website?
Yes, so they can go to our website, that's www.cwgc.org, and what you can do there is book a ticket to any one of these events. And we've got some digital events, so if you can't get to a site, you'll be able to view some of our live streams which are taking place from these sites. And of course, we've also got the volunteer tour guides that will be at even more locations across the UK. So there's something for everyone there. And if you do miss War Graves Week, if you're someone that's lucky to get away, then you can still book a talk from one of our Cantor speakers further down the line, or you can join one of our tours later on in the summer.
Well, it sounds like a fascinating initiative, and it's really good to see it happening, because these sites are so important. In my little village here, there's a single war grave to a man who was wounded on the attack on the River Selle in October 1918 and died of his wounds, and he's buried overlooking the colliery where he worked as a young man, and the school where he went to school, and his house is just 100 metres away from his grave. And it sort of brings all of that together, and I think it just shows what you can get from these sites.
Absolutely. I think having these sites here in the UK, very often, because they're family graves, that was where they grew up. So they did grow up down the street, and they are very close by to their life, but before going to war. And that's another thing as part of War Graves Week. The functionality on our website will change slightly, so you'll be able to see the First World War casualties, where we have the information available. You'll be able to search where they lived and then where they are now. So you'll have that opportunity to see who's buried in your local area, but also who was from your local area. So that would be really interesting for people to have that further connection of, they might be buried, overseas, somewhere far away, but they grew up here and they did the things that I did, but just those years ago.
Yeah, we still walk in the space of that generation of the Great War in so many ways.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Megan. That's fantastic. I look forward to seeing how War Graves Week develops and for future developments overseas beyond that.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you. Our next guest is James King, who's an area director of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. He's here to tell us about the sharp end of the Commission's work, the work and the maintenance they do right across sites in the United Kingdom. Well, thanks for joining us, James. It's really great to have you here. And we're here to discuss the War Graves Week that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission are organising for this month. You work within the UK as a member of Commission staff.
That's right, yes. I'm the UK Northern Area Director.
And so how did you come to work for the Commonwealth War Graves Commission? Do you have a connection to someone who fell in either World War?
No, so my background, believe it or not, is 20 years in the leisure industry. So very different background to a lot of my colleagues in the Commission. I wasn't getting that satisfaction at the end of the working day in the week of really feeling like I was giving something back, and saw this role at the Commission, and was lucky enough to get it, and here I am.
So what's the scope of the work that you do for them?
So it's amazing to try and get your head round the scope of the work we have to do in the UK. So including Ireland, we've got just under 14,000 sites, so 13,700 sites, which is over half of all the sites that the Commission look after across the 153 countries. So we've got 336,000 points of commemoration in the UK alone, within those 13,700 sites. So everything from our large-scale naval memorials, like you'll find in Portsmouth and Plymouth, right the way down to small churchyards scattered all over the country, from the Highlands right down the way down to Cornwall, where you might have 1, 2, 3 headstones. So the scope of what we do in terms of names on memorials, the number of commission headstones we look after, the number of private memorials we look after, and then everything down to a mixture of names on screen walls in cemeteries, foreign headstones, and other markers. So we've got teams spread out right across the UK in each region, looking after all of that estate. So everything from the large structures right the way down to single headstones. So huge scope of work for us to cover with a team of 115 in total.
So that big diversity of sites, from, as you mentioned, isolated graves through to bigger cemeteries that look more like the ones that we see on the Somme or in Normandy, through to big monuments, that must create its own problems and its own challenges.
Yeah, we have so if you take our scattered, the scattered element of our estate right across the country, we've got a team of skilled maintenance craftsmen who, on a 2 to 5 year cycle, go round and check that those headstones are legible, they're upright, they're not sinking, they're clean, and just to check that everything is okay. And as part of that, they will go around and clean those headstones, but it's only every 2 to 5 years, depending on the rural nature of where they are and the size of the team in that region. So it is a real challenge for us, but one that we're, and certainly in the last year has been a particular challenge. But considering the last year, the guys out in the field have done a fantastic job, and worked all the way through the pandemic. So we've managed to stay, we're happy we managed to stay reasonably on top of what we have to do. Interestingly, one of the things that we've done recently is, which you've probably seen or read about, is launching our Eyes on Hands on volunteering program. That's been a fantastic success so far. Almost too successful in that we're having to slow things down now to make sure that we reach out to our volunteer community and train them effectively. But that's going to massively help us in identifying problems that we might not find for a couple of years, and actually being able to send our skilled teams out to deal with specific issues and problems quicker. So we're up to over 1,600 volunteers now across the country. And we've actually frozen recruitment at the moment to get those people trained up and get their knowledge to the level we need it to. But that's going to, thanks go out to all those people, because they're going to make our lives much better and allow us to use our resources much more effectively. And also it's engaging with an audience that enjoy what we do, appreciate what we do, and that's going to be a big benefit going forwards.
I would guess that the diversity of those different types of sites and with ground that you're very often not in control of, must create a few issues for you. I mean, on the Somme, cemeteries are defined areas, aren't they? But an isolated grave in a churchyard surrounded by trees and other structures, this must throw up all sorts of issues for you.
Yeah, we generally categorise our cemeteries depending on access and safety. The majority of them are well looked after. We do get some that are overrun, get overgrown, and there are some that for many years have been overgrown and we haven't had access to, and that's where we have to alternatively commemorate elsewhere or as close to the casualties' graves as we can. We've got very good relationships right across the country with local church parishes, local councils, and there's no way we could manage all of that estate without the support of contractors and some of the individual people that go and mow the lawn in their small churchyards every week. So we've got a number of relationships with people right across the country that make the job possible.
So in many respects, it's more of a collaborative affair than we see on the battlefields of the First and Second World War, where it's defined teams of people doing the work.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a large horticultural team, really experienced, very capable, and they tend to look after the larger plots where we have horticulture. So anything with over 10 headstones in a line, that's the ruling for us to have horticulture on site. So borders, planted borders, turf maintenance, and our team of horticulturalists across the country go round on their regular rounds and look after those as part of their work. We've then got the skilled maintenance craftsmen who go around and make repairs, replumb headstones, realign headstones. We'll deal with replacing cracked or broken headstones, replacing headstones that are illegible. So that's the maintenance element of what we do, and they will work in both plots and on scattered headstones. And then obviously we have our bigger projects as well, our sort of more milestone projects. And we have a very robust condition survey process. So every 5 years, we run through all of our key structures. They get assessed once every 5 years on a rolling programme. And from that information, we then highlight some of the bigger works we have to do. So as an example, last year, we did some major drainage works on the Plymouth Naval Memorial. We renovated the cloister ceilings on the Runnymede Air Forces Memorial last year and brought those back to their original state with some really interesting work there. That the cloister ceilings, we identified some original paintwork that had actually been painted over in, we think, the 60s or the 70s. And from looking at pictures of when the Queen opened that site in 1953, we actually reinstated, from a conservation perspective, some stars around the cloister ceilings, around the Commonwealth badges that are on the ceilings, and brought it back to the way it should have looked when it was opened. So there's some bigger ticket projects that we have to do every year to make sure our bigger memorials are kept in really good condition. So we do everything, like I say, from that one headstone in a small churchyard, anything can appear on the list of works for us to do, right the way up to, you know, major naval memorials.
And how much does the modern world and to a degree perhaps climate change affect some of the work that you have to do?
Yes, I think it's a really interesting point, and we've started to go down the route of a sustainability and conservation approach to everything we do. So certainly, if you look at some of our central London memorials, so if you take Tower Hill, for example, traffic pollution, you know, turns the stonework darker very quicker than it would in a rural location. But we're also looking at things like chemicals as well, and becoming chemical free, and how we do that. So the world is changing and becoming a little bit harder to navigate on that front, and we need to keep up with it and keep moving and keep being dynamic in what we're doing.
Yeah, I mean, is it no mow May at the moment, where you're not meant to mow your lawn or your garden to create the sort of wild aspect that is good for the environment, good for nature? I suspect that's an issue for many isolated war graves plots as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's, again, there's a balance between that and achieving something that looks right and remains to our standards. We do have on some sites wild meadows that we only cut a couple of times a year. So it tends to be more of a planned approach of where we should be cutting and why, and when we shouldn't be cutting. But certainly where we can, we do like a wildflower meadow.
And during your travels around these sites, do you find that people are surprised to discover that there are war graves scattered across the UK?
I mean, you know, I could take it from a personal point of view, Paul, where I've only worked for the Commission for just over 14 months, and I'm staggered by the amount of graves there are within 5 or 6 miles of even where I live. And I think it's, although people tend to get drawn to our larger sites, so like the Runnymedes and the Brookwoods, you know, and you've got places like Stonefall in Harrogate, it is amazing what is on your doorstep. And I think, you know, having spoken to Megan, that what we're trying to do with War Graves Week and through our UK portal is really highlight that to people, that there's for me personally, there's, you know, the historic elements and the stories. I'm only just starting to scrape the surface, but, you know, there's lots of options for people to go and learn about the stories of the casualties and what people went through and what their sacrifice was. And it's on everybody's doorstep. And it is amazing once you do get out and start looking what is there.
It's important, isn't it, to engage people so they understand the importance of these sites, and also, I suppose, how they connect us to the wider history of both world wars.
Yeah, I mean, you just have to go to somewhere like Runnymede and look at those 20,000 names of the missing from World War II that are on the walls of those cloisters. And, you know, it really, every time I go there, it just brings home the massive loss that we suffered, you know, across the Commonwealth. And our number one priority at all times is to do whatever we can to make sure that those people aren't forgotten.
So the bulk of the work that's done from a day-to-day maintenance basis is done by your teams of people. But as you mentioned, you rely on people to sort of keep an eye out for things. And is this something the Commission, that as part of this War Graves Week, would like people to do?
Well, I think we've got a number of volunteer opportunities that we've been working hard on over the last 12 months, and and been doing that through the pandemic, and certainly making a lot of plans and trying to implement things ready. So the next stage for us is to try and recruit over the next 6 months to a year the next batch of volunteers for our Eyes on Hands-on programme. But people have been very patient up till now, and anybody listening out there that's signed up to be a volunteer and hasn't yet had their training, thank you for your patience. It's really appreciated. We need to get some more volunteers, but we need to be really strategic about where we recruit them. Because of the scattered nature of what we're asking people to do, we want to make sure we recruit people somewhere where they've got a cemetery that isn't allocated and they've got something to go and look at that's going to constructively give us some feedback. But yes, engaging with people out there right across the country, and people understanding what there is out there to go and look at and what's close to them, is really important to us, and something that we're working really hard on and will continue to do so.
And as you travel around to visit these sites, do you have favourites that you like to go back to?
Oh, good question. I mean, I think Runnymede is a very special place, as I do Brookwood, and they're quite close to my home. So during the pandemic, I've been there quite a bit to see the teams, because it's been easy to get to. I think the other ones that really I find really interesting, and I've only been to a couple of the Magnificent Seven in London. So I've been to Nunhead and Abney Park, and I find those really interesting, that you can walk through what is basically now a nature reserve of these, early 1900s cemeteries, really overgrown, places now where people generally go and walk their dogs or go for some peace and quiet. But you'll be walking through one of those cemeteries and you'll just see through the bushes, surrounded by broken down and early 1900s headstones. You'll see one of our headstones there standing upright, very clear to see, right in amongst the undergrowth. And I think there's some sites like that that are really interesting to go and have a walk around and look and see what you can find. But I would urge people to go and have a look if they don't already, and start to engage with that history and look at the stories of the people behind the headstones or behind the names on the screen walls. Because quite often, there's a lot of our larger memorials are there to the people that were missing. So they've got no known grave, but the name is still there. They still had a part to play in what happened. And their memory shouldn't be lost any differently to somebody who has got a headstone and we know where the burial is.
And indeed, as we emerge from COVID and we can begin to travel and go places again, the great thing about this War Graves Week is that we don't have to really travel that far. Everything's around us. Like you said, was it almost 14,000 sites?
Yeah. There's 13,700 sites in the UK. So we usually say that most people have got a war grave within 5 miles of their house. Obviously, you can't say that all the time, but that's generally what we look at. So War Graves Week is obviously highlighting our biggest sites, and there's a number of guided tours which people can engage in. We've had to keep the numbers limited for obvious reasons, but this is our first War Graves Week, and I would like to think that it's something that will be back again next year in hopefully a more normal environment, and then we can really engage with more people on sites, and hopefully a few more people will be prepared to travel that little bit of distance to one of the bigger sites and come and see what we do. Come and see what the stonemason team do, come and see what our horticultural teams do, and really start to get a bit more of an idea of the work that goes in behind the scenes to look after those 336,000 names.
Because the work that the Commission does is not just about record keeping or something that's locked in the past. It is a day-to-day thing, and the maintenance in perpetuity means just that, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's like the Forth Bridge. We start one end, we paint it, and then we get to the other end and we start again. And that's what we do. We do it with a lot of pride. And I know the team, we've got masses of long-term experience and people that have worked with the Commission a long time. And part of our challenge going forwards will be to start to bring in some new younger people, hopefully, and to make sure that all of that knowledge and experience that we've got gets passed down, ready for the next generation to come through and the next 100 years of looking after all of these important names.
And given the nature of what it is that you commemorate, you were saying that you were searching for a job that had a bit more meaning for you. Do you think you found that job now?
I'd like to think it comes through loud and clear, Paul. I have. It's a really every day is a school day. And I know that's a cliche, but it's very true for me personally. And the number of anomalies that we find in individual cases where, why something has been commemorated or somebody's been commemorated the way it has. We we come across situations where burial grounds are being built on, and we have to go through all the formalities of working out, how we're going to commemorate people that were in that churchyard. Where are we going to commemorate them? Why? The commemorations team, the work they do and the extent they go to make sure that casualties are commemorated as they should be, to the best that we can at the point of burial or as near to it as we can. The lengths that the commission goes to is super staggering. I think our biggest job as the UK team, working with all our head office colleagues, is to get the message out there and to educate people on what's on their doorstep. And it's good to be able to talk in this sort of forum for people to understand some of the operational work that goes on behind the scenes by, what is quite a small team, really, when you think of the number of sites and the number of commemorations we've got. But they do a cracking job, and we will continue to do that.
Well, thank you, James, and I hope to see you at one of these sites when that's possible again.
No, great. Thanks for having me on, Paul. Much appreciated, and great to speak to you.
Thank you. It's War Graves Week, and following our chat with two members of War Graves Commission staff, I've come to Barnsley Cemetery, right in the heart of Barnsley in South Yorkshire, where it's a massive civilian cemetery, and around me are the graves of the people of Barnsley, covering the history of the town over many centuries. And of course a key aspect of it is the mining industry and people connected with that, and the graves of men who died in colliery disasters here long before the Great War. And I'm walking up the central aisle here, tree-lined aisle. The birds are singing in the trees, and around me, of course, are the typical sort of headstones that we would expect to see in what is essentially a Victorian cemetery like this one. But here and there I can see the splash of white that we're used to in the cemeteries of the Great War. And around me in the trees are the birds, just like the cemeteries on the landscape of the Western Front. Cemeteries are part of the environment in which we live now. But here as well, of course, amongst that white splash of stone is what connects us to the history of the two world wars. And coming to a cemetery like this is how we connect with that history and discover more about those who served and those who died at home. I've just come off the central aisle, and this is a good example of it. There's a White Commission headstone here with, for this region, the familiar cap badge of the York and Lancaster Regiment, the cat and cabbage, the white rose of Yorkshire, and the tiger beneath, symbolising that regiment's service in India long before the Great War. And here's a man of the York and Lancaster Regiment, Private Holt, who died on the 24th of March 1918, aged 25. I would guess that he's one of those possibly wounded in the March offensive of 1918, brought home for treatment and has died of his wounds in a hospital in Britain. And this was one of the facets of those who died in the UK, that no matter where they died within the UK, they could be brought back home for burial. So if they died in London or in Scotland, at the costs of the government, at the cost of the War Office, their body would be brought home for burial. In some cases they remained in cemeteries where they died. When I lived in Kent, there was hospital cemeteries there where men had died in the hospital in Canterbury or in Lenham and had been buried there, and their graves remained. But in most cases, unlike those who died on the battlefields, this was the family's chance to bring them back, to have them close to home, for them to come and visit them. And just as there were cemetery pilgrimages to the battlefields, I would guess that throughout that interwar period and indeed beyond, families came to visit these graves to connect with their soldier who'd given his all in the Great War. Now, this has been an episode of Guests, and I'm really pleased to meet up with Martin Garnett here in Barnsley Cemetery. Martin's worked with me as a battlefield guide on the battlefields of the Great War, and it's just over 5 years ago, Martin, that we met on the Somme at Sea.
We did. It seems a long time ago now, doesn't it?
Now, you've grown up in Barnsley, and here is the history of your town in this cemetery in many ways.
Yes, absolutely. The cemetery really is a representation of how life was in the town over 100 years ago now. We have the highest from aristocrats to miners, a mix of everyday life 100 years ago really in this town.
And amongst the war graves, I mean, we see the white headstones around us, and we can see some York and Lancs close by. But there's also on many of these graves, and this is the added feature when you come to a cemetery in Britain, are memorials to men killed overseas.
Yes, absolutely. And this one here to Sergeant Reginald Dunk of the 13th York and Lancaster Regiment. He was actually he was killed he was wounded on the Somme on the 3rd of, he died on the Somme on the 3rd of July 1916. However, before the Somme, he was actually posted at Suez in Egypt, and he saved 2 men in the Suez Canal, and he was given a special award. And he saved 2 men. He was a member of the Barnsley Swimming Club. I was a member too many years ago. I was a bit thinner then. But he saved 2 men in the Suez Canal, and he was given an award for bravery for saving these 2 men. He went back to France in March 1916. And he basically lasted 10 minutes in the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Really, he was wounded. He was found wounded, but they never found his body. And he is now inscribed on the Thiepval Memorial in France. To believe it or not, his story has always interested me, because in John Cook's book, he describes his account very vividly about what Reginald Dunk did, and also it's sad that it came to such a sudden end. And obviously, with him being a member of the Barnsley Swimming Club, and I've been a member of the swimming club as well as a youngster, it certainly brings everything into perspective.
And it's interesting to see that they describe what we now call, I'm familiar with the title of Barnsley Powers, but they call it the Barnsley Battalion.
Yes, we had two Barnsley battalions, the 13th and 14th York and Lancasters. The territorial regiment was the 1st and 5th, but the Barnsley battalions were a representation of the community of this town. The 13th was the 13th predominantly was the vast majority of the upper working class were officers. For example, Thomas Guest with A Company, he had a grocer's shop in the town centre up on Market Hill. And we also have Harry Scargill here as well, who was I'm trying to remember off the top of my head what his job was, but he worked in Eldon Street North, and the famous quote is he left an article in the Chronicle saying that he'll come back to his job when the war was over. He never came home. And
the Barnsley Battalion was absolutely archetypal of these POWs battalions that we think of every time we think of the Great War, in particular the Battle of the Somme. I mean, we're here in central Barnsley. All around us are terrace streets, the streets which you grew up in and which they grew up in, and it was that environment that really created the possibility of POWs.
Yes. Yeah, a great deal of community. There are many examples of a lot of family and friends joining together, brothers, fathers and sons. The vast majority, obviously, mostly friends as well, who'd worked in the same colliery together, worked in the same factory together. Very many people went into the army straight away because of their history in the army as well. Thomas Guest being an example of that. He served in the Boer War, and he came back into the colours in 1914 as a result of that.
And that sense of community, having lived here now myself for nearly 5 years, that's still very, very strong here, and because of it there is a big awareness of the POWs, isn't there?
Yes, there are many examples all over the town. The War Memorial in the town centre specifically is designed not only for the POWs battalion but for the 4,000 men and women of this town who were killed over the course of the war. If you go to many of the churches, predominantly St Mary's Church, you have memorials to the York and Lancasters of the parish of that area. The station at Holyrood Church in Barnsley, the Stations of the Cross are dedicated to the Barnsley pals who never came home. Also, you have memorials in various places in the towns and in the villages, especially in the churches around the local villages in the area. The sense of loss here is very profound in this area.
I mean, that's a staggering figure, isn't it? I mean, nearly 4,000. Barnsley really lived in the shadow of those losses for quite some decades after the Great War.
Absolutely, it had a massive impact on the town. Many wives and many families who are obviously from colliery mining families as well ended up very they only usually had to rely on one income from the breadwinner, and obviously if the breadwinner wasn't there was no money coming into the house, so as a result the effects on the family and also the children as well, having no father or any stable background to look up to as well, that had a tremendous impact in the town.
And I've noticed in the last few years, attending the 11th of November commemorations, either down in Elsker and Hoyland or in Barnsley, the numbers seem to be growing every year.
Yes, they do, and that is very encouraging. I think it's one of the few areas, especially for the Battle of the Somme in particular. The Battle of the Somme had a tremendous impact on the town, incredible impact. There was more losses on that day for this town than probably any other day in the entire war, and that still has a lot of resonance today, most definitely.
This is a year, Martin, that we've not been able to get over to the battlefields in the way that we normally do. And coming to places like this is a way for us to reconnect with the Great War out there.
Yes, absolutely. It's been a hard year for people such as myself who've been very eager to get back out into France and Belgium. Obviously, you keep hoping for the best. You hope that you'll get the chance to go back over there as soon as possible. Obviously, circumstances over in Europe have denied that opportunity.
And then when you wander around this cemetery, you see the names of all those familiar places, died of wounds on the Somme, fell at Arras. It immediately transports us back.
Yes, it's a wonderful thing to have, really. It's nice to, it sounds really odd to say this, but it's really nice to pair up families to graves that you've seen, particularly in France and Belgium.
Because, we live in the environment that they knew before they went to war, and we know the environment as it is today where they fell. And it is that incredible connection between those places.
Yes, it has an incredible connection. It's one of the nicer things, actually, that these places are still here, so that obviously in times of a pandemic we are able to reconnect and readjust ourselves to what we truly enjoy, and that's our history of the Great War.
And it's nice to see, in the distance there's a lady walking her dog. And I think that's quite nice, actually, because it means that the cemetery, just like the cemeteries on the landscape of the Western Front, are very much part of people's lives.
Yes, absolutely. Sadly, the cemetery doesn't get visited as much as it used to do. But obviously, for someone like me, it's a treasure trove of information for people who want to learn and understand the consequences of the Great War.
We've now come to the grave of Israel Scargill, and you've brought me here, Martin, because it also commemorates his son, Harry Scargill, who we were talking about before.
Yes, Harry Scargill worked at Eldon Street North. He was a draper, I believe, off the top of my head, and he put in an article to the Chronicle saying that he'd reopen his shop when the war was over. He never came home.
This is one of the things that connected me to Barnsley many years ago, because I went into one of those famous junk shops in Eastbourne and picked out a postcard one day of a sergeant of the York and Lancaster Regiment, and on the back was the name Sergeant Harry Scargill, and that's when I discovered he was from Barnsley. He was in the Barnsley Pals and was killed on the first day of the Somme.
Yes, he was one of many that day who went over the top and never came home. He's buried at Euston Road Cemetery in Collingham, just a mile away from where he went into action on that day, and he's one of many men from Barnsley who are buried in there as well, and many officers from the 13th Battalion York and Lancasters were killed as well on that first day.
And the photograph of him is one, I've got thousands of them, but it's an extraordinary one because it's such a powerful image. He's looking back at you from the past with these haunting eyes, and I'll put it on the podcast website for people to see. But it's just those tangible things that bring the whole story together. Yes,
it brings everything together, really. If you see a gravestone in France, and obviously with restrictions and the pandemic, you're able to come to places like this and you're able to reconnect and understand the situation, the realisation of where you are. And also you've got to remember there was a family at home as well. That is very important. We have to remember that there were families at home, and many families suffered a great amount of loss to events such as that.
Well, that's it. It's the echoes of what happened over there went way beyond the battlefield, and his wife and his children and his parents, they were as much victims of the Great War as he was.
Absolutely. It's the effect on the effect of such a loss on a family, especially if he was the only boy in particular, would have had a tremendous impact on the family, and also on the street as well where he worked, because obviously people wouldn't be able to go there anymore as well. And if he was the only draper in the town, where else are you going to go and then catch a train to Barnsley or to Leeds or to Sheffield for that case? So there's that impact of not only his loss, but also the loss of a business, and also the loss of an industry as well, that has a great amount of influence in the town as well.
Yeah, and I think his shop was close to where the Barnsley bus station is now, and I think of him every time I take the bus to go back down to Elsica. It's quite something, really, and I like the way that does connect you to places here. You know, the whole story of one man and what he did.
Absolutely. There's many stories of businesses in Barnsley that were affected by the First World War, particularly the Battle of the Somme. Obviously, we have Harry Scargill here, but we also have Thomas Guest of A Company, the first Barnsley Battalion, who was killed on the first day. He's remembered at Tate Val, but here the Greengrocers, which is now the pub on Market Hill. So it's amazing. Businesses are made in different ways, I suppose, but Thomas Guest in particular is important to remember, because he was the famous quote is that before he went into battle, the night before he asked for a shave. He wanted to face the enemy in good order. So I always think that's a very interesting story. And the final quote in the before he went into battle, he claimed to have said, "Over boys and give them hell."
Well, these stories are just so rich in human detail. It's not just about the bombs and the bayonets, is it?
No, absolutely not. It's so important. It's like I said before, one of the great things about this town in particular, that some of these gravestones are still, so we can still be able to connect with them. We can learn the stories, and there's also loads more to understand as well. I think there's also a belief that some things are fixed. There's always something next you can always find out, either by the internet or by simply going to a library or to the archives.
And I often think that these stories and these soldiers sometimes find us. I mean, Harry popped out of a box of postcards in a shop in Eastbourne nearly 40 years ago now, and here we are, you know, all those decades later, standing in front of the memorial to him in his hometown of Barnsley. Yes,
absolutely. It always seems to come to you, always come to us. I mean, for example, there's a gentleman here, Mr. Dryden, Edward Dryden, who was killed and is buried at Regina Trench Cemetery in France, and he was a conscript, and his house was basically just literally across the road from where we are now. It was his first battle. He was a conscript, and it was his first battle, and he never came home, and he was the only boy in the family. So you can imagine the impact of that on his mother and father as well. It's all around us. It's something that we have to, as historians, particularly local historians, we have to embrace that. It's very important.
And of course, most of the Barnsley Powers did come home. Most men survived, but they too would have lived in the shadow of all this, with the war memorials and wandering those familiar streets where they'd grown up, but there were absent faces.
Yes, very much absent faces. There's a very famous photo from May 1919 when the colours came home after the First World War, and Lieutenant Colonel Hewitt, who was the commander of the 1st Barnsley Battalion, made a speech outside Market Hill, close to where the old town hall was, and the numbers of the original pals that were there were very, very different from the ones that are gone on the train on Christmas Eve 1915.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's just amazing to think of these stories, and coming, it just shows, you know, here we are, we've just looked at a handful of graves, and we've brought alive aspects of so many parts of the Great War.
Absolutely. Like I said, so local cemeteries have so much to give. I mean, and people think it's a bit morbid to go and visit old cemeteries, but if you're a historian and you want to understand something, come into these cemeteries, understand them, look at the gravestones. Every gravestone has a story in it somewhere. It's very important. And in Barnsley in particular, there are men here who were killed in Barnsley who have died from all different parts of the world: Gallipoli, Salonika, obviously France and Belgium as well in there, and there's also some naval people who were killed at sea as well. So if you really want to, if you ever need somewhere to go for a bit of quiet time and a time to reflect for yourself, have a walk in the cemetery, learn the stories. It certainly, especially in these times, in pandemic times, it's nice to come to these places and just have 5 minutes to reflect and remember, and not just to remember the ones who were killed in France, but also to remember the ones who lost loved ones at home.
Well, under the sound of that blackbird, we've come round to this grave, which is a very personal one for you.
Yes, it is. I call him the soldier across the road. This man, John Norman, he was a captain of the 13th Battalion York and Lancasters. He served on the Somme, but he survived. Went back to France in March 1917, and he was killed. He was killed quite close to where many of the Barnsley pals were killed on the 1st of July. And he's buried at Sayre Road number 2 cemetery, I believe, at the top of my head. Quite close to where many of his comrades were killed on the first day of the Battle of the Somme.
And the Great War's been an interest of yours all your life, hasn't it?
It has. It started many years ago when I was about 10. I watched initially Professor Richard Holmes' War Walks as a 10-year-old, and his half an hour on the Somme absolutely captivated my imagination. And the Christmas after, then I got the Barnsley Pals book from John Cooks off my grandma Garnett, and I must have read that book back to front. I'm on my 3rd version now because I could not keep it down, and ever since then it's always inflamed my interest. Incredible. It's sad really, because in a way, for me personally, I love the First War since I was 10 years old, but I never actually went over to France until I was in my 30s. So really, for me, it was a bit of an awakening in that respect. But it's, for me personally, to see to come to this memorial, particularly where his father and mother are here, and also his grandfather are buried as well. It's something to have a wonderful connection to.
And these men in their stories, we see them here, but when we're out there on the ground, they're like our beacons, aren't they?
Absolutely. I mean, for me personally, I've been to visit him twice in France, and although he's not a relative of mine, or I have no relation to him whatsoever, I have a very close affinity to him because I knew where he lived, I knew where his girlfriend lived, I know where his family lived, and I also know the profession that he did, and that's something that, you know, for me personally, it brings you closer together to that person than probably even your own family members even, really.
And they do become very, very personal to us, don't they? We become connected to them. Incredibly
personal. It's very, I mean, I think, if memory serves correctly, it's one of the few stories when you go to I mean, for me personally, I actually didn't realise about this gentleman until the second time I went over to France in 2019, and I went over with my father, and we went. It was I remember particularly, it was a Wednesday. It was a really hot day. It was the longest day of the year. It was solstice day, and we actually stopped off at Sayre. We went to visit the Sheffield Memorial in Sayre itself, and then we walked back to our Land Rover, and we had a walk in the cemetery. And we went up to the top, because if you go to the top of the cemetery itself, if you look over the wall, you have a perfect view of the Sheffield Memorial Park. And obviously, seeing a York and Lancaster 13th Battalion Normandsel, you think, oh well, that's a Barnsley connection, obviously. And then you go down to the register, you pick out the register out of the box, and you see there, and then the shock horror of realising that this man lived closer to you than you probably thought possible. And that's very, very, and for me personally, that was a very moving part of the day.
And I guess that's, you know, how you of the younger generation, how the story of the Great War and how what it means to us, how it continues.
Yes, but also I think there's also a time of evolution as well. That the veterans, I mean, the last veteran died many years ago, Harry Patch. For youngsters like me who are in the 30s, obviously that connection, obviously, to the younger generation has gone as well. But we have to remember that there's also, with the archives, we're also able to go back to that time. We can also look at the interviews. They also give us a greater understanding of what it was like to be in that situation in that time.
The Great War's never been more vivid.
Absolutely. I think it's it always has something more to give. It never stops. It has an incredible effect on, for those who want to understand it and want to learn about it. It has a tremendous impact, and also in pandemic times as well, it has that kind of benefit. You're able to come to these places and understand things better. So that when you do go back, you have a greater understanding and knowledge of what actually happened in that area.
It's been a fascinating walk round Barnsley Cemetery, and everywhere we've walked, myself and Martin, we've come across the history of both World Wars. We've just been looking at the grave of an airman who died in World War II. There's so much in places like this, and in this first War Graves week, I really would encourage you to go to your local cemetery, use the Commonwealth War Graves Commission app, or use their website to find out what's in your locality and go and have a look. It's such a rewarding thing to do. And again, I mean, if you listen to this, you know my love of birds and nature, and here I am seeing blackbirds in the trees above. It's very much a place where the old world and the new world comes together, and the new world is rumbling away in the distance just beyond the edge of the cemetery the cars going past and the buses and the lorries. Life renews, life continues just as it should. But here, amongst the birdsong and amongst the headstones, we can reconnect, walk, at least not to, but in the direction of our travels along the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.